Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and we're back for our third episode of Summer Scouting for the 2025 NFL Draft. Now, I'll go ahead and warn you guys, this week's episode and the one that will follow either next week or maybe 2 weeks down the road, just because there's a lot of players I've got to go through still, these are going to be longer episodes. It is going to be all the guards, all the centers, and all the tackles who are generally consensus high players. We're going to talk about them. And then next week, we'll go through cornerbacks, slot players, so slot cornerbacks. And then we'll talk about safeties. So there's a lot of prospects to go through for these videos. And so it'll be split up for this one into guards to start. I've got 5 of them we're going to talk about. And then we're going to get into tackles, where I have 10 prospects. But hey, a lot of the time you get guys in college that end up transferring out of tackle to guard when they get to the NFL. So I think it'll be a good balance, but a lot of players to talk about. Just a forewarning, this will be a long video. So, totally understand if people don't watch the whole thing because it's a lot to talk about. But we are going to start, like I said, with the guard class. I've got 5 prospects to talk about. And there's a lot of players here. Maybe not the first guy as much, but I think a lot of players that should have a very good career in the NFL as starters. And it's a really exciting class, especially at the top. And then once we get into the tackles, you have a lot more prospects, I feel like, that you could group up together. As much as people talk about like Will Campbell and Kelvin Banks Jr. and some of these guys at the top, I don't think it's as clear cut as far as who is clearly leading the race right now. And so I think we're going to learn a lot of things from the college football season on where these players are really going to fall. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this with our first guy. I've got Donovan Jackson. It's my lowest ranked guard at this point. Still a 3rd round grade for him though. When I look at Donovan Jackson, I see a guard who may be generally a little bit undersized. At 6'4", he might look even shorter on the field potentially. And I think he's a player that probably ends up projecting as potentially a backup into the NFL. Now, he might get a shot starting, so we'll have to see what happens. But when I watched him, I wasn't as impressed as I thought it would be, especially with, as you'll see throughout the series, how high I am on most Ohio State players. I am very high on a lot of them. And so, it was a little surprising to me that he ended up being around here. Now, getting into actual notes on Donovan Jackson, this is the player who has a very strong, stocky frame. He comes in at 320, and given that he might not be 6'4", that does change how stocky he is, because if he's a 6'6" guy, this is all of a sudden maybe a little bit more normal. It's also pretty tall for a guard, to be fair. Donovan Jackson does play with quick feet. He has pretty good movement skills. I gave him a B+ as far as his athleticism. And one of the things that is a positive when you end up being a shorter prospect, and why I'm not really someone who hates it all the time on the offensive line, is sometimes you get that natural advantage with leverage. Because with a lack of height, your arms are going to be your arms are going to be lower to the ground. And so you're going to end up getting into people's pads a little bit easier. You'll see guys like the next one we'll talk about, perhaps, where it's going to be harder for them because they're taller. Maybe they're a little bit out of position even. Maybe more of a tackle prospect. And so it makes it hard to get contact where you want to get contact. But it's one thing I really like about Donovan Jackson. You want to go back to a previous example of this from the last class, not a pro comp, but someone who had a similar issue and really just isn't as much of an issue to me would be Christian Haynes, where he's not like a super tall guy, right? He's like 6'2.5" roughly, and he ends up being really good because he's still got the length in his arms and he's got natural leverage and he fights like hell on plays. And so, it ended up being a great pick for Seattle, getting him in the 3rd, but that'd be an example of a player where I really just don't see the height maybe being as much of an issue as what you'd normally think. And then the final positive that I wrote with Donovan Jackson was that he moves defenders in the run game. He helps create running lanes. He is a positive. in that aspect of the game, although I did end up giving him the same grade in run blocking as I did with pass blocking. Now, getting into concerns, this is a little bit longer of a list for me than what the positives were. He is short, like I said, not as much of a concern, but it still is there. And then he only really has decent arm length. It's not a lengthy prospect, so that is going to hurt him on the interior, and you can see it at times where he's just at a disadvantage, even against defensive tackles. He's also a player who does not absorb hits well. His anchor is pretty poor. He gets knocked back quite a bit, and so ends up coming in at a D- for me. Actually, should explain really quick at the end of this, just all these categories we're grading off of, so I'll do that in a moment. The other thing with him, he does not square up blocks like I'd like to see. Defenders are able to break off of him often. Sometimes they even just run by him. And so that is a big issue. If you already have length issues and you cannot get your block squared up, you can't be at an advantage early on because you're going to lose very quick. And then I also wrote, hand placement. And this kind of goes wrong with squaring up blocks. The hand placement needs work. Needs to get better contact. Needs to get contact in the right spot. The leverage is a little bit better, right? Because he's a shorter guy. But you got to be able to use that because there's also things that don't work out well with that because you got to be strong in the legs and all these other things. But the final concern I wrote for him, I feel like his awareness is a little bit lacking as well. Sometimes, like I mentioned, where guys will just get right by him, and that should not be happening on the field. Now, the grades here on the right, just to go over them really quick. A lot of them we've already talked about with maybe some of these other players. Athleticism, straightforward, right? We've discussed that before. How fast are you? How can you bend, and just how good of a pure athlete are you as a player? We have run blocking as well. We have pass blocking. Those are the next two. We have anchor, which is going to be how strong you are when maybe you're getting challenged with a bull rush. Are you getting knocked back? Are you powerful in the legs? Can you stand up to that? And then we also have physicality, which we've talked about before. Are you going to be a physical player? Are you going to bring presence in that part of the game? Because that is a very important part of the NFL. And we see, at least in my opinion, a lot of these teams that succeed, they win in the trenches. These are teams that are physical, and they're going to dominate their opponents, get into the heads of their opponents, and that's how they're going to win. And you even see that in other sports too. Take hockey, for example. If you've watched that recently, a lot of these teams who are succeeding, look at like the Rangers and the Panthers, a lot of physicality. So I think it's a general thing in sports and something you definitely want to see out of your trench players. So I think that really sets the tone for a game. Now, talking about my summary on Donovan Jackson, I wrote that he's a short, stocky guard prospect with good athleticism. He has quick feet in the pocket, allowing him to get in front of defenders and use his natural leverage advantage. Jackson does struggle against pass rush moves and speed to power, not being consistently ready or having the ideal tools to combat it. Jackson does well in the run game, getting to his place and creating open lanes, but he doesn't consistently nail his blocks. With size limitations, it's hard to imagine Jackson being an ideal starter in the NFL, even with his improvement over the last season, but he should be a priority backup. And my pro comp for him is actually an interesting one. I ended up going with Wyatt Davis, who's another Ohio State guard. This is another one of those maybe looser comps, but both players, just talking about how they're similar. Shorter, compact guards coming from the same school. Both were pretty proficient at run blocking and pass blocking, not a clear strength over the other, but both of them also had very poor anchors. And then they're both good movers, and they're players that generally did well to have the skills to mirror in the pocket. And so, to wrap up Donovan Jackson, right now he's late third. I don't know if he rises past that. I'm not sure he gets out of the third. And the film I watched, it's all 2023 film, watched Notre Dame, Penn State, and Michigan. So we'll go ahead. We'll get to our second prospect here at the guard position. We start getting into, I think, what are players who should be starting in the NFL, even if they're a little bit older, which, Donovan Jackson, pretty solid age, kind of average for what you see. Now, Tate Ratledge might be kind of hard to read that up in the top left. He's a right guard. Don't have an exact age. I'm guessing 23. He's been in college after this year for, I believe, 5 seasons. He is a tall guard. He is built like a tackle. He is 6'6", 310 pounds. And it's very interesting to me that he's playing guard because, for how much I think college football teams, I guess they don't consider size too awfully much, but when you have someone who's big enough to play tackle, you're usually putting him out there. They have a left tackle on their team that is built like a guard, and they have a guard on their team that is built like a tackle. It's a little confusing to me why they haven't seemingly at least tried swapping positions for them, because it feels very obvious, but we'll talk about the other guy here in a little bit. But there's another prospect here who it feels like he's out of position too, but you look at Tate Ratledge's size, and that's the immediate thing I think of. He is a tackle build as a player. Now, things to note on Tate Ratledge: he has a lengthy frame. He also has meat hooks for hands. He has huge hands. He is really quick on the move, and this is a guy that when you're watching film, you get flashes of a mauler. You get flashes of a guy who's going to put people into the dirt. Not consistent enough, but still the flashes there, and that's good, especially when you're talking about these guys that are maybe a little bit smaller. I think 310, talking about guards, not the biggest size, right? And that kind of is a factor into why the size gets a C+ here, because I think he's a little too tall, like we were talking about when we started this video. Because 6'6", it's hard to maybe get down low enough and get leverage all the time. But you have that, and you have a 310-pound frame with that. I think that's not ideal for a guard, but if he's playing tackle, maybe that goes up to an A. I mean, somewhere around that range, I think, is where it lands. Now, he also does a really good job sustaining his blocks and pass protection. A big difference between him and Donovan Jackson. That is something that I feel like a lot of prospects I've watched throughout my time have not been proficient enough at. And so it's nice when you see a player who can actually sustain. So something I'm really impressed by with Tate Ratledge is that. He's also very good at combination blocks, maybe, handling stunts or working with other guards and tackles and centers on the offensive line to pave open a running lane. Now, disadvantages with Tate Ratledge: he is a waist bender. It's something that I'll note for a couple guys on here. Didn't really notice it first, weirdly enough, when I was watching my first prospects here, but I was wondering why they look so weird. It's like, well, they're not getting their legs down. They're not getting their waist down. They're just bending at the waist. And you end up kind of looking at the ground then, and you don't really get to, I think, diagnose what a defender is doing as well when your head's pointing down at the ground. So it's not really ideal. The height as well, like I mentioned, I think it's a disadvantage being that tall. At guard, just my personal opinion, it makes it really hard for him to get low in his stance, which is why I think he bends his waist so much, or ends up just playing too upright in general. He also doesn't really stay square on defenders in specifically run blocking. So there is a key difference there, because pass protection, he's very good at getting squared up and staying in the fight and sustaining blocks. But in the run game, just generally kind of a different thing there. He's also, as a hands fighter, it's decent. It's not super impressive. That's an area where I want to see him improve. And that'll probably help out with his physicality a little bit to be better in that area of his game. He also needs to do a better job of finding work in pass protection. I was not happy with how often he was finding other guys. It felt like at times he just kind of stood there too long. So it's something that I think really needs to improve. And the final concern that I wrote for Tate Ratledge was that it feels like he's just out of position. Mentioned this already, but this guy has the size to play tackle. And meanwhile, on Georgia, they've got a guard-built prospect playing tackle, and it's like I don't get why there's not a thought about maybe swapping them up and getting him more experience. It might work better for them, but I get it. I mean, they both played their positions a decent amount, and you don't want to just change everyone up all the time. Now, my summary for Tate Ratledge, I said that Ratledge is a lengthy guard prospect who almost feels out of position. While size is usually an advantage, he struggles to get low enough in his stances and has a bad habit of bending at the waist. Ratledge still plays a good brand of football, blending a combination of athleticism, arm strength, and aggression, but I wouldn't call him dominant in any one particular area. He's more of a proficient player that made impact plays consistently on film. With his size, I wonder if a team should give him a shot at playing tackle. Ratledge should enter the next draft class as an experienced plug-and-play option for an NFL team, and my comp here ended up being Cole Strange. I have Tate Ratledge graded as a middle of the second round guy right now. The reasons for my comp, these are both prospects that were very tall and lengthy guards coming out. Both were built for the athletic side of the game too, not guys with a crazy amount of weight on them for guard. They're both effective at moving defenders at the second level and being a good asset in the run game. I gave him better grades there. And both prospects as well were older, more experienced prospects, not these super young players. These were guys that returned, guys that if you've scouted before, you probably looked at them the previous year. And so they're going to be players that you feel pretty confident about as far as projections into the draft. But it also raises the question, is Tate Ratledge going to maintain this position? Because we feel like we've seen a lot of what he has to offer, but you've got prospects who rise every year. You got guys who come out of nowhere. Quinyon Mitchell last year, for example, Terrion Arnold. Like, your top two cornerbacks off the board were not even on people's radars, really. I guess Quinyon was a little, but not people you thought were going to be CB1, at least if you ask most people. So that'll happen, and I could see a world where maybe Ratledge falls into the third, ends up being an early third round pick, just with where I think he's going to end up with players rising inevitably over the next year. Now, getting to our next guy, I've got Jonah Monheim, who was a really fun watch and remind me a little bit of Graham Barton. I'll talk about that at the very end, but you could see why I liked him so much, because Graham Barton was one of my guys last year, one of the people I liked the most. And so, Monheim is a really experienced player. It's the guy who's played a lot of different positions. He's going to get experience at yet another one this year, transitioning to center. He is currently going to be, he's 22 right now. He's going to turn 23 right after the draft this next year. He has a pretty good build, I think, for center. Maybe a tad taller than average, but that's fine. It's not a big deal. 6'5", 305 pounds, probably needs to bulk up a little bit, but I think generally a lot to work with there. Now, he does have a lot of experience at different positions. Like I said, I think he's played like 3 or 4 of them at this point. So he has played all over the offensive line. And I think at worst, this is a prospect that you could really have as a plug and play guy anywhere on the offensive line, or really, if you don't even think that, he's going to be someone who can back up a lot of positions and provide a lot of flexibility there. Now, he's also a player who has a lot of experience being used as a pole blocker, which is a really good thing for the Jacksonville Jaguars if they're considering a prospect to bring in, because they're going to use that a lot in their game. He plays with good leverage as well. Even at 6'5", being a little bit taller, I think he does well. Now, given a lot of this film was at the tackle position, because he did play, I believe, left tackle last year. So it's a little bit weird of an evaluation. We'll have to see how he plays the center, of course. But other things to note on him, he's a player who doesn't show his hands early. He has quick punches, and he's going to keep defenders guessing. And when he shows his hands late, I don't mean that as in like too late, but just, keeps them to himself long enough. He does a really good job lining up his blocks. So it's a great combination. He also gets movement in the run game because of that punch he shows and the leverage he has. He often positions himself very well, and he's sealing off lanes at a very high level. In addition, this is the player that I thought at tackle did a really good job mirroring defenders. And so there's the question of, can he still play tackle? I think he could in the NFL. I think that's very much in the cards. He has very good core strength. He's a high motor player as well. He's someone who's going to stay involved in any way he can. He's not going to be afraid to help out on a block. And his recovery ability is very good. There was one play, I can't remember who he was playing against. It might have been UCLA, but they were calling him the dancing bear like they talked about with Cooper Beebe last year, because he's got this guy who's just constantly like trying to juke him out and go each way possible. And Monheim is just keeping up with them, flying around the field to stay in front of this guy. Like, he is a high effort player, and to me, a very hard prospect for a team to miss out on. So, I mean, he's a good player. Like, he's an early second round guy for me right now. Now, of course, there are concerns, right? Because if you're an early second round guy, you're going to have some problems, right? It's not the end of the world here, but these are things that you still got to watch, right? He does appear to have short arms, which is probably why he's moving into the interior this year. Same reason why people talk about Graham Barton being a potential center at the next level. He also is moving to a brand new position. So what happens if Monheim just doesn't play as well at center? What happens to his projection? You know, is that going to raise questions? Is that going to push him down the board? Those are concerns. I will say, though, if I was a GM and that happened, I would absolutely be taking advantage of that and still picking this guy maybe in the third round when teams aren't even thinking about it, or wherever he ended up falling, depending on how bad of a season. Like, that's where I would be, because I really believe in this guy. Even if he has a bad season, I think it's more so going to be, hey, maybe he's not a center. But other things with him, he is an older prospect, right? He's going to turn 23 right after the draft, so he's not ideal age. Not the end of the world, though. And it does come with experience, of course. So that's the trade-off you have. And some teams really like that. He also could improve his play anticipation a little bit. And I do think he needs to get a bit stronger to play on the interior. Because the 305, that's already small for a tackle. But I think as a guard, might need to bulk up a little bit more. Because you think about who you're going up against. If you're a tackle on the edge, you got to be fast, right? You got to be more athletic. Because you're playing against guys who are usually like, 250, 260. When you're playing on the interior, these defensive tackles are anywhere from like 290 to even up in like the 320s. So I think the demand is going to change there. Now, I did get to watch Monheim a little bit at center. Now that I think about it, I forgot to mention that. I believe his last game of this season, he was playing center. I know at least one. They moved him there, or it was at guard, just somewhere along the interior. So you can see a little bit about how he performed in that situation. Now, getting into my summary on Monheim, I say that he was a sound, experienced offensive line prospect who's proven his value at a multitude of positions. Entering what should be his final season, Monheim will be playing his fourth different position. He does about everything you could ask out of an offensive lineman at a high level, playing with good leverage and technique, making an impact on the move, and sealing off lanes in the run game. While his tools aren't great, Monheim makes the most of them and has overcome them so far. However, short arms will likely keep him from playing tackle, and the vast majority of his experience does come from outside, so the upcoming season will play a huge role in his projection. Monheim has proven to be a smart player, and he should continue to be an impact player despite the transition. So I had a B+ on him, early second round grade right now. My comp is Graham Barton. Reason why, just to go back through that a bit, I alluded to it a little bit, but both players, tons of experience across the offensive line, but they're mainly tackles and guys who are probably going to have to move inside because of size concerns. Also, both pretty good technicians, and they do a really good job with their hand fighting, with their aggression. The difference between the two, though, because there is a key difference. That's why these comps are not just end-all, be-all, 100% perfect, right? Monheim is a little more refined with his aggression. Barton, when you watched him, is maybe a little more fun to watch because his mentality is just to kill or be killed. He is either going to end someone's career or end his own career. That's just the way he plays the game. And it's fun, and usually those players, if you give them time, end up figuring it out, especially when they're technicians, like both of these players have been. Very smart guys who have a lot of experience and and I think could put it together. Now, the film I watched for Jonah Monheim, all 2023 film, it was Stanford, Washington, and Louisville. And in case I forgot to mention it, because I think I did on Tate Ratledge, I watched for him 2023 film once again, South Carolina, Ole Miss, and Alabama. So hopefully we got that cleared up there. Now, we are going to be getting into some of my absolute favorite guard prospects here. We got two guys left there. We're going to move into tackle after. The next guy is one of two very special players from Alabama. And the other guy's, of course, an Alabama player too. If you know anything about the guard position in this class, you know what two players I have left. First guy is Jaeden Roberts. These guys just impressed me a lot. I was watching interviews from both of them over the past couple of days because, you know, as a Jaguars fan, this is a position I think is really important to scout this year. Because the way I'm looking at things right now is that your offensive line has a lot of questions after this year. You have one legit starting tackle locked up in the future. You have Ezra Cleveland, who you have at least one more year out of after that, and you still have questions about him right now just because of how last season went. In the center position, you know, you have no backup plan really behind Mitch Morse that I think is good long-term, and Morse will have one more year left, and you will have the ability to move on if you deem that necessary. And of course, with Morse, like, as much as we like the signing, there are concerns about how good of a run blocker is this guy. He's had concussions as well, we've heard. So there's issues to go off of there that, you know, it could end up not being as good of a signing as you want. But I think, simply put, the future of the offensive line is a ton of questions. And so this whole group of players we're looking at is going to be very important towards that, because I think next draft, this should be a top focus. Whether or not it is, this is where I think they need to be looking. But getting into these guys, these are both natural leaders, both players that I think have phenomenal mindsets coming to the game, and they both have something very special about the way that they play. For Jaeden Roberts, that's his strength. His strength, and what I mean by that is literal strength, like arm strength. He is insane. This guy, some of the numbers you hear with like what he bench presses are ridiculous. And they were asking the whole team, like, who is the strongest guy? And you keep in mind, you got a 350-pound guard and Tyler Booker on that team as well, who's very strong himself. Every single person saying Jaeden Roberts. He is a special player, just like Tyler Booker is, who we're going to talk about in a moment. But with Jaeden Roberts, he has a really good frame, I think, for a guard. And it is a frame that is mostly filled out. And at 316, like, you think more of maybe an athletic guy, he does not play just like a good athlete. He is a guy who gets super physical in the run game. He is really good at getting in position, using his athleticism to be in the right spot to seal off lanes. So I really like what he's offering in the run game. He also has great torque. When we're talking about him getting in front of defenders, trying to twist them to the ground, he has really good core strength to work off of. So that's where you get into this, like, this shocking amount of strength that this player has for a 316-pound guard. You just really don't think about that too often. His athleticism, well, I've said it's pretty good. It's not great, right? I gave it a B-, but I still think it's a positive, and that's why I have it listed in this category, the positives. He can also do a really good job, I feel like, resetting his hands in pass protection when needed. So he's generally getting good placement, but when he doesn't, he does a good job being able to adjust and then get into the right spot. What is really crazy about Jaeden Roberts, too, he has 9 starts as a player right now. 9 starts. And he is playing like a potential early second-round pick at this point. That is impressive. And I think it says a lot about how much better he could get just from this upcoming season. And what's even crazier about it, one of his best games was against Michigan's championship defense. It's awesome stuff here. I'm really excited to talk about Jaeden Roberts. I think he's going to be one of these very good prospects that could be available maybe early on day 2. Now, there are concerns, of course, right? This is a 9-time starter. This is not a guy with a ton of experience. He's only played 9 games. His processing speed is still a little lacking. Sometimes he misses heads-up plays. So that will change over time, you would assume. He also does need to do a better job at the second level lining up his blocks. He's also, of course, with 9 starts, still very new to the position. So that lack of experience, it can be looked at as a positive, but you also got to ask, how well is he going to be playing right now if he goes up against maybe a technician or someone who's just got more smarts to his game because he's got more experience. So Roberts does have some things to overcome there, but still, he has a ton to work with. My summary on Jaeden Roberts, I wrote that he's a surprisingly good starter for his limited experience. And he's only started 9 games in his career, but he plays a sound game of football that visibly improved over the last season. Roberts has a great frame for a guard, having ideal length that's filled out well. He plays a nice combination of strength and athleticism, getting physical against defenders, and being used often on the move. When Roberts engages with defenders, he does a nice job of getting his hands in place and readjusting when needed. Given he's only logged 588 snaps heading into his final season, Roberts has areas that he can improve. His processing speed is sometimes questionable when he doesn't diagnose rushers, and he could do a better job of consistently squaring up with defenders. He's a good prospect right now, and I can only imagine how much better he will be with more experience. Now, my pro comp's probably kind of a weird one, because this player, I believe, ended up just dropping off a cliff in the draft. I don't remember why, but they do have a lot of similarities between them. Not to say that Jaeden Roberts is going to fall to the 7th round. I'm not saying that, but both players were lengthy, athletically built guards with really ridiculous strength that you really just didn't expect from their game. Both players were also players with very long arms. They both move around very similar on the field when you watch them on film too. Now, like I said, key difference here is that Hayes did drop off in the draft, and he really hasn't got a shot in the NFL at this point. But there's just not the reason to see that with Roberts. I couldn't think of anything that could really happen off field to destroy his game, because one thing you're going to see with him and with Booker, if you're watching interviews or listening to them, these are not guys who are going to get into trouble off the field or not going to take the game seriously. I think they have a very good mentality, and these are very safe players to take a shot on at the next level. Now, we got one more guard here, and then we're finally going to move into tackles. So, our final guard, I've already kind of gave away who it is, but it's Tyler Booker. It's my top guy. At first, when I looked up his metrics and such, I was like, dang, there's no way I'm going to like this guy. He's 350 pounds. Like, how is he going to be anything more than just, a guy that if you run straight at him, you're going to die? And that's just not the case. Like, he's young. He's 6'5", 352. Those are things, it's good being young, of course, but at 352, that's a little bit of a concern, but he's a good athlete. Surprisingly a good athlete at 352 pounds. I gave him an A there. He has a very big frame, and he is an incredibly strong player, and he is not a player who's ever really going to lose a battle of power. And when you're talking about maulers, talking about players who fit that definition, Tyler Booker probably has his face right next to the definition, because he is the definition of a mauler. He loves putting guys into the ground and constantly pancaking defenders. He moves very well for his size, surprisingly. You just did not expect that out of a 352-pound guy, but that's the way he plays. And what's crazy, too, is that he is right now trying to get off some of this weight, too. So with how much power he has and how good of an athlete he is already, might be even more of a fit for the Jaguars doing that. Now, we'll see, of course, because you sacrifice some things when you get smaller. But it's not going from 330 to 310 and being undersized. It's going from being massive to, being pretty dang big. So I think he's still going to be fine. I think it's a good move for him. He's another guy just like Jaeden Roberts that has really ridiculous core strength. And someone who's going to be able to torque rushers, going to be able to win even when maybe he's not in the best position. He's going to have the just pure power to be able to overcome that. Booker also has really good grip strength, and he makes those nice heads-up plays. He's a player who has some pretty good experience already at this point in his career as a 20-year-old and turning 21 just at the time of the draft. He also is someone who, in the run game, consistently stands up defenders, consistently gets the leverage. He's also rarely penalized. And the final thing I wrote about him, and this was mainly taken from watching the game against Michigan, was that just because he has a bad play occasionally, it does not stop him from being a better player after that. It does not stop him from continuing to play well outside of it. He has a short memory. That's something you want to see. You don't want to see guys who they get beat and then they just crumble. Tyler Booker, he's a guy who's going to give it 100% all the time. He's going to learn from his mistakes, and he's going to do his best to make an impact. Now, getting into concerns, being 352 pounds last year, he was not an explosive mover. He was not an incredible athlete as far as his movement skills, but still, good athlete. He also needs to work harder to sustain blocks, sometimes where he just lets people off too quick. He also struggles when overwhelmed with speed. It's a big issue for him, and maybe that's part of the reason why he's getting off some of this weight, is to help him be a faster player. But if you want to see an example of that, you can watch the playoff game against Michigan. While that was a really good game for Jaeden Roberts, Tyler Booker did struggle in that game. And it's not the end of the world, right? Because that was an incredible defensive line. We'll even talk about some of those players down the road. And we already talked about one of them last year in Kris Jenkins Jr., who you guys know was a big fan of mine and someone I had as the last pick of the first round. I had him 32nd overall on my rankings. But Booker did struggle against them, so it is an area of improvement. The speed to power can also catch him a bit off guard at times. Sometimes, like when you're going up against people who are refined at that and they get a good shot at you, that anchor can be a little bit off, but still, the anchor is usually really good. That's why it's an A+, because outside of the speed to power that he occasionally was challenged with, is damn near perfect. And then the final thing, he is an aggressive player, so sometimes he ends up getting a little too aggressive and he'll end up losing balance. But generally, not a lot of major concerns, not things that I don't think can be fixed. I think it's a matter of refining your game, and you think, like, with this guy being 20 years old, he's probably going to figure it out. So great stuff here with Tyler Booker. I wrote for my summary on him, I wrote that he's a massive road grading guard who imposes his will through elite strength. He has great core strength and plays with great leverage, allowing him to control blocks and keep the pocket clean. You wouldn't expect such a player would be a good athlete, but Booker is good on the move and makes an impact moving into the second level on run plays. Despite being just 20 years old, entering his final year, he's undoubtedly one of the smartest prospects in the class, which directly plays into his sound play. Booker has areas where he can improve, such as learning to play against technique and combating pass rush moves. And the playoff game against Michigan is that clear example that Booker does struggle against players who know how to combat those physical gifts, how to catch them off guard with such as speed to power. While Booker is a well-developed prospect, continuing to refine his game this season would set him up as an elite guard prospect. And for some, you can put him there already. For me, it's very fringe, right? He's not a player who's going to get an S grade from me for the overall, because that means like blue chip, top of the first, right? He can be a blue chip player, and I think he'll probably end up being that, but as a guard, that kind of limits it. You could also make the argument, though, that if money justifies positional value, guards are paid what cornerbacks are. And can a cornerback go top of your board? Yeah. So there's a little bit of a debate there, I think, on how high you can take a guard. You also got recent examples where maybe it didn't work out as well. Kenyon Greene, for example. Not a player who's worked out great. And I think he was taken like 15th overall or 13th overall. He was an early pick, right? I feel good about Booker compared to him, but it's hard for me to say, okay, let's take a guard middle of the first round. That's where I kind of struggle with it, and I want to have more questions answered before I maybe move him up there. But these guard prospects at the top of this list, they are phenomenal players. And I realized one of the reasons why I like Tyler Booker so much is because kind of remind me a little bit of Osiris Torrance. Both prospects, just talking about this pro comp, they have huge frames and they fill them out really well. And they're shockingly good with their athleticism. They're both dominant players in the run game as well, players who impose their will consistently. They're both players who are very smart. They're refined late in their careers. And both of them felt like easy projections to the next level. Just, may not be the sexiest pick, but if you go get one of these players, you're going to be happy with it, right? And obviously it brings up sad memories because the Jaguars passed on Torrance, but, I think Booker is going to be that level of a guard prospect again. And probably, I'd have to say better just because, Torrance fell to like 56th in the draft. So, or 60th, somewhere around there. So too low at the end of the day. But to give you an idea of how much I like Tyler Booker, he is, for me right now, the third overall offensive lineman that I have out of the top 15 guys that I scouted. And he's probably going to stay somewhere around there, depending on how many tackles have great years. But I've only got 2 tackles above him. Now, with this all said, let's go ahead. Let's shift our focus to the tackles. Start getting into that position. I'll probably try to move through it a little bit faster just because it's going to be really long if I don't, but we'll still get through all my notes. My lowest ranked guy is Blake Miller. Just someone I was not impressed with on film. It just felt like his whole projection is based off of his size. He's a right tackle. He is a young one. He's 20 years old right now. He'll turn 21 a little before the draft. He's a tall player. He's 310 pounds. So kind of similar height, actually, and size to Jonah Monheim, although maybe a little more lengthy. So that is a key difference, but the two players use it very differently. So my positives for Miller, I wrote that he's got a lengthy frame. He fills it out well enough. He gets movement in the run game as well. And there are plays where you can see him be a little bit of a mauler, pancake defenders. And throughout the season, because I try to watch games that are split apart when I can, that is when I have a bigger sample I can watch off of, because I usually am just watching 3 games for these guys. Blake Miller, over the season, you did see minor improvements. And the final positive I wrote, which is not a ton here, but this is the final one, his speed is decent. And I think as far as a puller, he's good enough to get that done. But a lot of these things are just good enough, right? They're not incredible. And you see his grades overall are generally kind of average or maybe a little below average. Now, getting into concerns here with him, he's a player who lumbers around. His movement is usually pretty lethargic. And he's also someone who struggles to diagnose blitzers, makes some pretty poor decisions on the field with his protection. He also doesn't do much with his hands, doesn't know how to use them. And really, it's almost like he engages and then he just kind of stops doing anything. And the only thing he's doing is moving his feet, if that. And he often moves his feet too late. He also plays really tall. Being 6'6", that's usually good size, but you got to get down your stance. And it just doesn't feel like he does. It feels like almost at times it's like a random person who's tall pulled off the street, told to go block people. And it almost appears when he's playing, it's like he plans for nothing except for a bull rush. He's getting beat constantly when he's challenged by essentially any other move. So that's a concern. I mean, it's multiple concerns, really. But these are really big problems for him right now, why he's not a top 2 days pick for me, or top 3 rounds, you could say. He also doesn't show the ability to sustain blocks consistently, which goes along with, not fighting with your hands and your feet after initially engaging. And then the final thing I wrote for him is that just as far as leverage, it feels like he doesn't understand it. And so I wonder if this is just a matter of he's not getting good coaching, but there's a lot of projection. And so it doesn't matter to me too much that, hey, he's got great size and he could be really good. What are you going to be, right? What is the likelihood that you're a very good player? Because I'm not going to take that risk early in the draft when I'm not confident that you're going to be that guy, especially if we got to put you on the field early. I don't think that's good. But my summary for Miller, I wrote that he's essentially all tools heading into his third season as a starter. He does possess good length and exceptional power that he uses in the run game, but he needs to develop in most other facets of his game. Miller isn't a great athlete, having adequate speed, but a general lack of flexibility. His processing skills are an issue on film, often showing up in missed assignments and free rushers getting free shots at the passer. Miller also struggles to stay engaged with rushers, forgetting to use his hands and quickly losing leverage. Unfortunately, this makes Miller a liability in pass protection and ideally a developmental prospect at the next level. But I do think that, given we are doing summer scouting right now, he's got a whole nother season to prove otherwise. He's got a season to show that he's got something there. And if he did decide to declare this year, maybe there's more to work with. But I think realistically, Miller's a player we'll probably make minor improvements this year, return to college football, play another year, and then maybe he's getting up into, the day 2 consideration at that point. Maybe teams see it very differently. That's just where I'm at on him. Not super high. I ended up actually comparing him to another Blake. This is the immediate one I thought of just because of the first name, honestly. But it's actually a pretty good comp in Blake Fisher. His players have very identical frames. Also players who kind of move in the same way. They were both very much developmental prospects late in their college careers. Both guys that when I scouted them, I just wasn't a big fan. I don't even know if I actually had Blake Miller on my draft board at the end of the day. But he ended up going pretty early, and I think he actually went to the Texans. So that's where you kind of see, if I said Blake Miller, Blake Fisher, that's what I mean. He got drafted to the Texans and was not really high on my board, if on my board last year. But that's the point with Blake Miller, where maybe he does declare, right? Because someone might just be like, oh, I'm great at coaching. I can pick this guy and make him great. Hopefully it's not the Jaguars, but I could see a team doing that. And then maybe Miller just does declare and, gets the decent pay and develops over some years, and we'll see if he becomes anything. But I could definitely see that. And the final reason for this comp, both players did struggle to deal with really a lot of things in pass protection. The only thing that it felt like they did well against for me was the bull rush. So that's where I ended up landing with him. The film I watched, all 2023 film, I watched Duke, Florida State, and Kentucky. So we'll go ahead, we'll start moving through this list, and we'll get back to a note I made from earlier about the Georgia situation on the offensive line and talking about Ernest Greene III, who I think is a guard, and meanwhile Tate Ratledge looks maybe a little bit more like a tackle with his size. But Ernest Greene III, he ends up being 9th on this list out of 10 offensive tackles for me. He's a left tackle. He's a young one. He's going to be about 21 years old heading into the draft. He's 6'4", so one of these shorter tackles, but he is a stocky guy, right? 320 pounds. He has a lot of core strength. And this is a player who does play with good aggression. It definitely made my positive notes on him. And he wants them all defenders. He wants to put people into the ground. He is a generally good mover in the run game. He's going to get people out of position and going to help with the gains on offense. He also has a good anchor, and I feel like he's a player who uses his hands pretty aggressively. I don't know if it's the best hand placement all the time. He's a raw player in general with not a whole lot of starting experience. As you can see, 2022, there's not even a PFF grade. First guy I've had that on, actually, in the process. but he does have aggression to his game, which is a good thing to work with. And the final positive I wrote on him was that it feels like he has a good understanding of where to position himself in the run game. Shows he is a smart player, at least in that aspect of the game. He can still improve on it, of course. 1 year of starting, you're not going to be where you are, where you're supposed to be by the end of that first season. I also wrote with him that as far as concerns, the length is mostly average at best. And I would say below average in general. It's not a major detriment, but it's just something where with his height, I could really see him working out as a guard rather. I think he'd be really good there. He also doesn't really have the consistent foot quickness to protect the edge. So I don't like him at the tackle position, which is why I'm like very adamant that they just maybe swap him with Tate Ratledge and give those guys a chance in better positions for him. He also is not a guy who does much on the second level. And when he's blocking, he'll occasionally overset and let rushers cross his body, which is the worst case scenario because that's the quickest path to the quarterback. At least if you force them to bend around the edge, it's going to take longer to get to the QB. But it is something that Greene does struggle with. He also doesn't have much more than decent flexibility, so wasn't really a positive for me when I was looking at it. And of course, with 1 year of starting experience, it's a very raw player. I think he can improve his handling of speed to power as well. And final concern that I wrote on him was that sustaining blocks would help him immensely. That is an area where he really struggles, and he often just ends up giving up too much ground trying to get good hand placement. It's like he's just backpedaling, trying to give himself a shot to be able to combat it, and by the time you end up getting where you want to be, you're pretty much in the quarterback's lap. So not ideal, but Ernest Greene the third, it's things to work with here. I mean, it's not just terrible stuff. He is a young player, and I think he's just one of these logical converts to guard. I wrote in my summary with him that he's a stocky offensive tackle who should strongly consider a move inside the next level. He plays with many elements you want to see in a run-heavy offense, those being aggression, plus leverage in the run blocking, and strong hands. Greene has ideal core strength, which allows him to overpower rushers when engaged. However, these elements don't consistently show up as Greene has limited starting experience. He struggles to protect the edge against rushers, often failing to kick out enough or even allowing them to cross his face. Greene clearly has athletic issues, struggling to kick out quickly enough to beat rushers to the edge. Greene also has a limited frame for a tackle, having no attributes that really stand out. These issues combined make him an ideal convert to guard in a run-heavy offense where his skill set can thrive. And speaking of what has been a run-heavy offense for a while, I ended up comping him to Nicholas Petit-Frere, one of the Titans' offensive linemen. I use this comp because both these players were shorter, stocky tackle prospects and guys that when you found their best moments, it was going to be in run blocking. They're both players that I felt like in pass protection, they had issues, they had inconsistent anchor, and they struggled to defend the edge and keep rushers from crossing them and to really try to eliminate both of those things and kind of let it become a double-sided sword to them. So, yeah, hopefully I worded that right. But yeah, that's kind of where I get that comp from. I don't know if Greene's going to be a great starter, but I do think there's things to work with. And it's just a matter of a team putting him in the right spot, which I really think is going to be guard at the next level. So I end up giving him an early third round grade right now. The film I watched, all from 2023, was South Carolina, Ole Miss, and Alabama. Now, getting into our next two guys here, I'll go ahead and spoil it. I've got two Oregon offensive tackles. First one I've got is Josh Conerly Jr. He is their left tackle. He's still a younger player. He's going to turn 21 during the upcoming season. He'll still be 21 at the time of the draft. He is a shorter guy. He is a smaller guy in general, 6'4" and 305. But he does have some good physical metrics. For example, it appears he has massive hands just off of images, and some of these things will probably end up being incorrect when we get official measurements way down the road at the combine. But just from what I can see, it looks like he has pretty good hands. So that's definitely a good thing to work with. He also, given his athletic build, does really well on the move as a puller, and he gets very low in his stance on passing reps. He does a good job getting leverage there. He also is proficient at mirroring rushers. Not really elite, but I think he's good enough to do it on the edge. So if you want to keep him at tackle, you can do that. He usually also comes out on top when he's fighting defenders with his hands. Does a very good job in that aspect of the game. And the final positive I wrote for him was that he does have a physical element to his game. He's a player who does want to put defenders into the ground. Not as much as other guys in this class, but I think it's still a positive and something you want to see. Now, concerns, there are more concerns for me than positives here. His anchor has room to improve, right? I gave him a very low grade. It's hard to give a guy a good grade when they're 6'4", 305 pounds playing tackle. But the leverage does help a little bit, which is why he doesn't maybe get an F, but just doesn't have the size you want. I think he is, based off the film and looking at pictures, maybe a little bit heavier than 305. Maybe he's being done a disservice being listed as that, but he still needs to bulk up. I think he's got a little ways to go. He's also a player who can be found putting his head down when engaging rushers, so he's going to struggle to combat their counter moves if he doesn't know what's coming up. He also whiffs too often on the second level. Not a guy I felt like was a really good impact on the move once he got out past the line of scrimmage. He also doesn't really displace defenders with his punches. They don't do the damage that you want them to do, which, you know, you can figure out why pretty quickly when you look at his overall size. And his technique overall, he's got room to improve there. While I've given him a lot of good compliments with how he uses his hands, he does need to improve his overall placement. He just has a lot of things going his way because he has big hands and he fights hard with them. And the final thing I wrote for him as a concern was that I felt like he can improve his defense of the edge. He is susceptible to speed rushers at times. So you want to see that improve, and it really makes you think maybe this guy ends up being someone who moves inside. I could definitely see that with Josh Conerly Jr., unless maybe, you know, some things changed this year, maybe some measurements were off, but this is what we've been told by the team, so often it's not better than what they report. But getting into the summary on him, I said that he's a young tackle prospect with some good tools to work with. He has good length, big hands, and a nice dose of athleticism. He shows good upside on the move and the desire to stay involved in the play. Many of these attributes come in the form of flashes on film, so it's definitely in the cards for him to take a big leap forward this season. He also has some concerns, which isn't all that surprising for a one-year starter. He lacks ideal strength and technique, too often being outmatched against good teams and not having the consistent hand placement to make up for it. While he's a good mover, he often whiffs on blocks at the second level, which limits him as a run blocker. I would also consider him as a potential convert to guard because of some of the issues that show up when rushers attempt to bend around the edge. The good news for Josh Conerly Jr. is that all these issues are fixable, and with improved technique and strength, I think he could compare favorably to a recent first-round selection. For now, it's simply just an idea of his potential. So Josh Conerly Jr., I gave him a C+ grade. That pro comp I'm talking about, that guy I think he could compare favorably to, is Jordan Morgan, who actually wasn't really that high on, but he was a first-round pick this last year. Reasons for this comparison: they have similar overall size. Difference is Conerly is slightly smaller than Jordan Morgan, but both players, generally good movement skills, not elite at protecting the edge though. Have some clear concerns there. Makes it potentially a situation where they convert to guard at the NFL level. They also both have a physical element to their game, but Morgan, I would say right now, the big difference in why he's a better prospect is because he has a better combination of technique and strength than Conerly, which is why I say if Conerly can improve those things, feel a lot better about this comp. But it's a loose one. It's more so of like, what can his ceiling be if he figures things out? And then my film reviewed for him, I watched all 2023 film, watched Texas Tech, Utah, and then the conference championship game against Washington. So we'll get to the other Oregon tackle here. Got the right tackle, and Ajani Cornelius. Hopefully I say that right. He's an older tackle. He's going to be 23 right after the draft, but does have a little bit better of size. He is 6'5" and reportedly 308 pounds. Maybe he's not heavier than him. We'll see. Just because I thought 305 was a little low for Josh. But Cornelius, first thing that stood out with him, he is a mauler on the field. That was the first positive I wrote on him. He has a lot of aggression, and he's got really good movement skills. I think he's got the skills to combat speed around the edge. And so I think he could really just stick out there at tackle permanently if he really wants to. He also is a player who stays involved in the play. He's often found pushing the pile for extra yardage, so he is going to be someone who's going to be involved, who's going to want to put in that effort on each snap when he can. And the final thing I wrote for him was that he has borderline elite mobility as a player. He allows him to turn his body against defenders. He does a really good job, like some of these other prospects, of just sealing rushing lanes, to get in position and to make sure that they can't collapse down on him, and it leaves the lane open for the running back to get downfield. So those are things I really like. Concerns with him, he is obviously at 308, lean for an offensive tackle. He's also a player who needs to improve his hand placement at this point in his career. He also does not have the strength to anchor well against that speed to power. Another D grade for anchor. There's a lot of players in this class that I felt like did not have the anchor that I wanted to see. And then he also appears to have small hands. You can kind of see on the picture, they do not look like big hands. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how it appears to me. So that could be a potential issue we see at the combine. And the final thing with him, he is a high hip prospect. You can see it when he moves. Kind of limits his flexibility, and why he doesn't get a really good athleticism score from me. It just ends up being an A-, because while he usually moves pretty well, flexibility just isn't there like you want to see with him. Now, my summary for Cornelius, I wrote that he's an exciting prospect because of his rare athletic ability and mauler mentality on the field, a combination not too common with tackles. Cornelius moves effortlessly and rarely finds himself beaten around the edge. He also shows the intelligence to harness his movement skills by positioning himself to seal off run lanes. When given the opportunity, Cornelius isn't afraid to put someone in the dirt or get involved in a traffic jam. These exciting elements present a high ceiling, but Cornelius still has refining left before he makes it there. He struggles to show consistent hand placement on film, possibly due to his hand size, likely due to his hand size, and he lacks the ideal mass to hold up against power. In addition, Cornelius has some limitations with his flexibility due to his high hips. Last season was the first year that he played against top competition, so don't be shocked if he starts to address these issues and become a complete prospect. I ended up comparing him to Matthew Bergeron. Reason why I did that was because these were both older prospects at the time they declared. They both had very similar frames, Cornelius being a little bit lighter, but they both kind of had issues with being high-hipped, having flexibility issues, just things that I felt like I saw when I watched them. Both also have pretty good movement skills and that aggression that you want to see, but they just struggle to anchor when they're getting challenged with speed to power, with bull rushers, with people who are just going to come straight at them. And so, part of the reason why Matthew Bergeron didn't go super early is because you had those concerns. And I kind of see the same thing with Cornelius now as a player, just maybe a little bit smaller though, which is obviously more of an issue. Now, film I watched for Cornelius, I ended up watching Texas Tech, Washington. And I watched Washington again in the conference championship game. So I watched 2 Washington games because Oregon faced them twice last year. I ended up having Cornelius with a middle of the second round grade right now, which is where Bergeron, I believe, ended up going as well. So similar projections at this point. Now, getting into our next guy here, and someone I think could end up moving to guard potentially, it was someone I liked a lot when I watched him, is Jonah, let me attempt to say it, Jonah Savaiinaea, coming out of Arizona. We're going to call him Jonah, though. It's a lot easier for me, even though we got Jonah Monheim as well. But talking about Jonah here, the right tackle. He's going to be roughly 21 years old at the time of declaring. Don't have an exact age. He's 6'5", 335 pounds. So he's a bulky guy, right? Big frame, fills it out well. He has the versatility to kick inside and play guard. He does have some experience there. And I believe he even got tried there at the end of this last season, potentially for their bowl game or just one of the final games, at least, of the season. He's a player who fires off really quick into his stance. And when he's on the move, you're going to see some great movement speed. You're going to see him really succeed in those situations, despite being apparently 335 pounds. He also, just a final positive here, talking about him, he plays with heavy hands. He has really good power in his hands. I love to see it. He was a really good player alongside Jordan Morgan on the air side of this offensive line. Now, I look more at Jonah as maybe someone who's still a developmental prospect at this point. I'm not sure I'd want to start him immediately, which is part of the reason you get the Kingsley Savaiinaea comp here. But my concerns right now, doesn't get a ton of movement in the run game. What I mean is it's not him moving, it's getting defenders out of lanes, putting them where you want to. He doesn't really impose his will like you'd want to see. He also isn't really effective enough when playing in space, which is some of the reason for talking about him being a potential guard. He's also more of a reactive player than an aggressor. Not someone that I felt like was really taking advantage of that size advantage he has. And, other things I noted with him, his anchor, well, I gave it a positive grade, just calling average a C, right? I gave it a C+. It's kind of inconsistent. He plays where it looks really good, plays where it doesn't. So, I mean, being a more reactive player and all that, he doesn't always react at the speed you want. So sometimes he ends up, losing a rep because of that. And then the final thing I wrote with him was that he arguably had better play inside at guard. I really felt that way. And that's why when I look at him, I really just see one of these tackle prospects that converts to guard at the NFL level and is really just playing tackle right now because he's the best one for right tackle on his team. You just don't have that same level of competition in college football for being a tackle, because in the NFL, well, you're going to put him where he's going to play because you've got guys on your team that can start if they have to. Most of the time, at least. Now, my summary for Jonah. I said that he's a versatile offensive lineman who has a good combination of speed and power. Very similar to Kingsley Savaiinaea there. He's often the quickest to fire into his stance, showing the ability to mirror and neutralize defenders. He improved his game throughout the past season, and had some of his best moments when kicked inside, so there could be questions about him sticking at guard. There are some issues with him, though, most of them stemming from ineffectiveness in the run game and the lack of consistent dominance in pass protection. Given his improvements, I do think that he should be a better prospect after this season, and I think he could warrant an early selection in the draft. I think, depending on where teams see him, if it's a tackle, he might sneak into the first round, especially just because of that size and the upside. If it's guard, it might be different, right? Because we talked about a lot of good guard prospects at the top of this class. So my pro comp for him, like I said, it's Kingsley Savaiinaea. My similarities here between the two, they're both tall, strong players, very similar frames there. They pair that with good athleticism, really good combinations, what stands out with them first. But they also are players who had issues protecting the edge, and it raised questions about their transition to the NFL level if they needed to move inside. There are also players that showed unexpected issues with anchor. They just weren't the dominant forces that you would expect for everything that they've been given or earned physically. So those were kind of reasons there. I also wrote that most of these issues are fixed by refinement. And so there's a ton of upside with both of these prospects, which is why Jonah could go really early. But you also look at Kingsley Savaiinaea from last year, and he ended up being, a second-round pick? He was a late second-round pick as well that the Chiefs made. So I think he'll be a steal for him, personally. But I could see Jonah falling potentially, just given what happened to Kingsley last year. So a lot of variety in where he could really end up. Now, getting into what is our top 5 here, I'm going to have some controversial opinions, and these are going to be guys that I think there's a pretty high chance they end up just being wildly different projections down the road, but these are the things I saw right off the bat. The next guy, my 5th offensive tackle prospect here, and someone I think should probably end up playing a guard in a run-heavy offense, I have Will Campbell. I thought he was going to be really high, right? Because there was all this talk when I scouted him about he's the best prospect in this class. He's going to be the first overall pick. Like, people were talking about that heavily. I just didn't see it with him. And I might have missed it, right? It's summer scouting, and a lot of these opinions, some of them might be good. Some of them you might just laugh at down the road, and it'll be fun for me to go back and do that too. But this would be one of those guys, probably. He's a left tackle. He's a young one too. He's 21 years old, heading into the draft. He's 6'6" and 320 pounds. All those things look really good, right? I have questions about his length. That's where I really am concerned with him. And I also didn't think he was as dominant on the field as what you'd expect. But I see the really exciting things for the most part with him. So getting into the positives, first thing I said with him, a lot of strength, like dense upper half, strong player. He's going to have that core strength you want to see. He also has the ability to mirror defenders well. Not consistent enough for me, but you can see it there. He also has an incredible punch, very strong hands, and in the run game, this is the best run blocker that we have, and I think it's my only S grade in the run game. If you're a run-heavy offense that needs to add another offensive lineman, Will Campbell is your guy. It's just the way I'm looking at it. He is going to pave lanes open in the run game, and when he's physical with defenders, it's as physical as it gets. Really good stuff there. I actually am trying to decide why I didn't give him an S there. I probably should have been higher, so that might be an issue. But really good physicality, regardless whether it's an A or if it's a blue chip grade there. He also, for the final positive, I wrote that he picks up rushers pretty well, diagnoses well, and makes those heads up plays. But the concerns, they're obviously here, right? Because he's looked at as a blue chip prospect for a lot of people, and I have him as an early second. So big difference there. But I wrote, as far as concerns, didn't feel like he reacted enough when it was players coming around the edge and trying to bend. He also doesn't really have the physical tools I want to see to combat that, because I think he has short arms and small hands. And apparently, what I was told by, I think it was while I was watching Hail Mary Sports Stream, and I asked him about the arm length with Will Campbell, he was saying that apparently he has measured in, and it was 33 inches, which I think might support what I'm saying. Why I say that is because colleges consistently screw up the numbers, and they always screw them up in favor of their players. If he's being measured in at 33 inches right now, and that is like below average, by the way, but that's kind of your minimum threshold for arm length at tackle. Generally, that's where it is. What if he's shorter? And he probably is in that case. It just was something that immediately stood out to me when I looked at him on film and in pictures. Like, he appears to have very short arms. all of a sudden now, you go from being talked about as a blue chip prospect to now, what if you're a guard? What happens then? It's really where things get crazy for me with him. I also wrote with him, the hits aren't always lined up well. I don't think he does a great job with his hand placement all the time. He also was a player who surprisingly didn't look for enough work in pass protection. I really wish he had more of that mentality. And the final thing I wrote was that it doesn't really appear that he has the length to control rushers when he's engaged with them. So, like I said, this is a player that it's probably one of my least confident projections right now, because it's so wildly different from where a lot of people have him, and there's things that are concerns that we don't know 100% about, and so he probably deserves to be maybe a late first, right? But this is just where I had him, because to me, I look at him as a guard, and I think there are better guards in this class. People who've actually played that position are just as young and would just be better options. So it really depends on if you need him, and he's also not really a fit for Jacksonville at all. So maybe that's some of the reasons. But getting into my summary on him before we move into our next guy, I did write for Will Campbell that he enters his final year as an elite run blocker with room to grow as a pass protector. He possesses immense strength and good athleticism that you wouldn't expect from a player of his size. He paves lanes open in the run game and can overpower anyone when he's on his game. My main issue is that he feels like a different player in the passing game, where while Campbell can mirror defenders and pick up late rushes, his reactions aren't consistently on time. This can lead to poor hand placement and being susceptible to long arms, which introduces questions about his length. While Campbell is tall, he appears to have short arms and small hands, which hurt him when engaged with rushers. Campbell has continued to improve throughout his career, but some questions may still linger at the end of the season. So my comp here, I ended up going with Tyler Steen. And the reasons why, I wrote that both players, you look at their size, height and weight is identical. They both got short arms. And Steen at the NFL level was forced to move inside, which I think is going to happen with Will Campbell. I think he's going to be a player that, while he's a very early pick right now, I think he's going to fall down the board and maybe be more of a late first rounder. Might even get into the second, depending on how they play this year, of course. He also, just as far as this comparison, I felt like they're both players that excel picking up blitzers, but they have room to improve in their hand usage and pass protection. And it should be noted, just as a clear difference here, though, that Will Campbell, he is a better player because he got 1 year left, and he is a far better run blocker than what Tyler Steen was. So it's not a perfect comp, but that was a player that came to mind. I gave Will Campbell, once again, early second round grade, probably realistically a late first, but this is where I would take him. And the film I watched, all 2023 film, I watched Arkansas, Ole Miss, and Wisconsin. So now we'll get into the other controversial one that'll make everyone quit watching probably. But I have Kelvin Banks Jr. as my next one at fourth overall for offensive tackles. He's a left tackle. He's a young one too, 21 years old. He is 6'4", 324 pounds. So a little bit shorter than what you'd expect. Okay, I'll leave that note for later. Getting into positives with Kelvin Banks Jr. He appears to have very good arm length, like really long arms, just massive size there, right? Just not tall. That's really the only thing that's lacking. He's a very strong player, lines up some really big hits. So he's very effective in that. And you also see the flashes of high-level athleticism from him. It's really just a matter of how fast he reacts. I also wrote that he's explosive when he engages defenders, and he doesn't let people know his next move. He's very good at hiding it. And then my final positive for him, I wrote that his hand usage is violent. So this is a player that you can get really excited watching him on film. And he grades out really well at pretty much everything. The lowest grade I gave him on anything was run blocking at a B-. Now, my concerns, and actually this was something I realized later as I was watching other guys, so I was like, dang, these guys are bending the waist. And I was like, that's what I was thinking with Kelvin Banks Jr. I didn't know how to word it. But Kelvin Banks Jr. is a massive waist bender. At least that's what I saw. Maybe I just watched 3 bad games from him. Who knows? But a lot of bending his waist. He leans too much on rushers and pass protection, and that's just not a good thing to have because it's so easy for a rusher to take advantage of it. It's so easy in the run game for someone to get off a block when you are just leaning on them completely and you do not have good leverage. So that's a major problem with him. He's also often late to engage rushers when they're coming around the edge. So he ends up getting behind and then he's leaning and it just doesn't always look good. It's just a general, it feels like he has a poor balance in general, although I don't see him go down on the ground all that often. I also wrote that he struggles to sustain blocks, struggles to line up hits, specifically at the second level in the run game. And finally, that I felt like his hand placement did need to improve drastically. So there were some concerns that I had with him. And this was the guy I thought was probably going to end up being my top prospect when I watched him, but it's mainly so much of it for me is how he looks when he's protecting. It just feels like he's leaned completely over, and you almost got to watch the film yourself to understand what I'm saying here. It's a very weird projection for me, and he might be another player like Will Campbell that maybe I just missed it on him. He ends up being a much higher ranked prospect. I think realistically, he'll be a first round pick. I feel a lot more confident in him because he has all the tools. It's just a question of like, why are you leaning over so much and blocking? Why is that necessary? I wrote for my summary on him that he's a high ceiling prospect who shows flashes of brilliance as both an athletic and a physical threat. He possesses a large frame that he fills out well and manages to win most fights with when he stays engaged. He's steadily improved throughout the previous season, but questions still remain to be answered this year. I worry about Banks' overall balance as he's often caught leaning too far when engaging defenders and lunges when rushers start to bend around the edge. There are times in the run game where Banks seems unable to line up blocks effectively, let alone sustain them. Banks has immense potential to be a blindside protector in the NFL, but he'll need to start refining his game before he declares. So my comp for him, I ended up going with Braxton Jones. Felt like the builds on the players were very similar. I don't think the weight gap is also as much as maybe what was listed for the players. Both showed pretty explosive movement when coming off the line and engaging rushers, but they also both had issues staying engaged with defenders, and they often lost leverage battles and just felt like both of them needed development. I think Kelvin Banks Jr. is a lot further along. I already have him projected obviously much higher than where Braxton Jones went, but I really just, for me, like, I want to see him improve with his leverage and how he's engaging people, get lower in his stance, bend at the knees, not the waist, right? Those are things I want to see. And if he can do that consistently, this projection is going to change wildly and it's going to look nothing like it is now. So let's move into these top 3 guys. And we'll get into one of my favorite prospects here and someone I think could be really, really good this next year and end up being a top pick. That's Josh Simmons. You'll see why I like him immediately when you see the pro comp at the bottom. But to talk about Josh Simmons, he has elite athleticism. Fantastic athleticism. He has lightning quick releases. He runs like a tight end at times on film. Watch him when he's getting out to the second level. He moves so fast. He also has those explosive foot movements. He's very shifty. He gets movement in the run game as well. And I felt like his hand placement in general was a plus heading into his final season. I know watching interviews with him, one of the things he wants to improve this year, he talked about a lot, is his technique. And going back and watching his film, which I've gone over, I think, twice at this point, he is probably right in saying that. I think a lot of it does come down to generally his technique needing to improve. But he is a player who's got an aggressive element to his game, not an incredible one, right? I gave him a B as far as his physicality, but I'd still say it's a positive. And where he's really going to challenge defenses is when they get him on the pole blocks, when they get him to the second level. I think that when he gets lined up, he's going to obliterate players out there because you're so much bigger, you're moving fast. Like, it's really exciting watching him. I had a lot of fun watching his film and just what he is. But he's also a player who has some questions still, right? The anchor is the biggest one. Is not a reliable anchor. There's plays where it's fine, and then there's plays where he will just get knocked back and it's not good for him. It's just not good results. He also, despite having elite athleticism, he needs to keep his feet moving when he's protecting the edge. Doesn't do that enough. He also, I felt like, could do a better job sustaining blocks. It kind of goes along with the foot movement, just, keeping your technique well, keeping yourself in position, all these little things. He also needs to improve his recognition skills. There were some times where maybe a rusher would come off the edge and maybe it would happen late and Simmons wouldn't always diagnose it. So he does need to improve there. He's also a player who's only been with Ohio State for 1 year as a starter, came from a smaller school, I think out in San Diego. I think it was San Diego State University. Correct me if I'm wrong if you want. But I know it was definitely a smaller school. So it was a transition and I felt like he did a really good job moving out there. But he was a really exciting player to watch, especially because of how well he lines up with the needs for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And, obviously the team needing a tackle in the future and my pro comp for him, which I'll talk about here in just a second. But my summary for Josh Simmons, who I have a late first round grade on, is that he enters his final season as a prospect with truly elite athletic tools. Simmons explodes off the snap, showing the ability to keep up with the fastest rushers on the field. You can rarely describe an offensive tackle as shifty, but Simmons is just that. His movement skills are reminiscent of a tight end, and they might be the best of any tackle prospect that I've watched in recent history. Simmons is lethal on pole blocks, often destroying defenders in the first and second levels to create rushing lanes, but with all these things said, he does have some big concerns he'll need to address this season. He was often displaced when attempting to anchor down, a constant plague in his film. Despite his elite athleticism, he struggled to protect the edge due to slow play recognition. Simmons should continue to develop this season and could be one of the first selections, but he'll need to improve his strength profile to reach his elite ceiling. Now, my pro comp, once again, I said Anton Harrison here, and the reason why I said that was because identical size for both players, both have very quick feet and truly elite athleticism to use on the edge. They're phenomenal movers at the position, and they just were really two players in that category, I think, that can't compare to a lot of other guys. One guy you might throw out is Dion Dawkins. I almost did use that as the comp here, but I went with Harrison. Other reasons why, too. They both were players who did well fighting with their hands. Felt like they were good in that aspect, but their issues kind of came against that anchor. Playing against speed to power, how do you combat that? Didn't feel like Josh Simmons does, I don't feel like he's done well enough there, and I feel like that was an area where Anton Harrison had to improve a little bit. I ended up actually watching more games on Josh Simmons than other prospects because I originally had a higher grade on him and ended up lowering it just a little bit. But the games I watched, all 2023, watched Youngstown State, Penn State, Michigan, and Missouri. So let's go ahead. Let's get into our top two guys here. Two players I think that are very safe projections. Rest of this list, I think they all have things that are pretty big they got to overcome, but I think the top two guys are very safe in general. The second overall guy, gonna give a shout out to the person who recommended me watching him because he wasn't on my list originally, since as a consensus player, he was not high enough to get on there originally. But shout out to Jay Shupp for mentioning this. Wyatt Milum out of West Virginia. I probably said his last name wrong, so God forgive me. But we got 15 prospects here, and we don't have any pronunciations yet. But he's a left tackle, 22 years old, I believe. Couldn't get a specific age. He is a tall, well-filled out guy as far as his frame. He has very good overall length. He has really strong hands. Has really great grip strength. He also is someone that, physicality, I think, is really good with him. He makes sure when he gets the chance, he's going to pancake defenders. I think he loves the physical aspect of the game. That's what was apparent to me watching his film. He has respectable athleticism, maybe not as much of an athlete as Simmons, and the top guy we'll talk about, but still, I think it's respectable. And I feel like he does well displacing defenders when he can get his hands on their chest. So when he's got that hand placement, he does great with it. He also plays with a really good understanding of leverage, and he does a really good job consistently getting himself in position in run blocking and creating those open lanes. He gets his body turned, and he will be able to anchor down and keep guys from getting past him. He is good in that aspect. The anchor is just maybe a little bit different in pass protection, which is my first concern here. I don't think that he has that strong of an anchor when he's in pass protection. He also tends to get a bit tall against bull rushes, which is what really impacts the anchor. You gotta get low in your stance and be ready to absorb the hit. He's not always able to do that. His balance also gets a bit wonky at times, so kind of hurts how I look at him as being a consistent pull blocker. He also needs to place his hands better when engaging. It's very inconsistent. You get points where it's great. You get points where it's really just not. His back pedal is also a little sloppy. So I have a lot of concerns, I think, with movement and maybe a little bit with flexibility, which really limits his athletic score, which still he's fast when he's on the move, but it's just when you're asking him to backpedal or really do anything else, a lot different of a player. He also drew a lot of penalties last season, so that's another thing he'll have to improve. I think he can fix that. I do feel good about that. But getting into my summary on him, I've got a late first round grade on Wyatt, and I said that he heads into his final year as a refined prospect who could have likely generated an early selection in the last draft cycle. I feel like if I watched him, given his grade here, he probably should have been at least an early second round pick. I think he's a good tackle prospect. Now, getting into some other things here in the summary, he has great length, is mostly filled out, good athleticism, and an impressive understanding of leverage. He does consistently put himself in the right place on the field to make an impact, whether it's paving a running lane open or neutralizing a pass rusher. While he needs to add some strength, he has strong hands that can be a problem when he gets into the chest of defenders. He isn't a perfect prospect, but his issues are relatively minor. He sometimes gets knocked back because of playing tall. He also struggles to consistently get his hands into position, which can be another issue when trying to stop rushers on the edge or cross body. While he's a good athlete, he isn't great, lacking ideal foot quickness when backpedaling. He also has shown consistent improvement, though, over the previous season, and most of his fixable issues are left to confront, but I wouldn't be surprised if he elevates his stock even more this season. Kind of had a loose comp here for him. I went with Jalen Duncan. The reason why I did this was because they have identical physical metrics. Milum is a bit stronger, but both players excel in the run game, really good in that aspect, and whether it's on the first or second level, and they both have a bit of a mean streak to them. They're both players, though, in pass protection, kind of struggle to kick back, to be good athletes in that part of the game when they're not necessarily just on the move, moving forward. But I will say that Wyatt is a more technically sound player. And I think that right now he's just straight up better. And he's obviously got this last year to improve, and this could probably be a different pro comp at the end of the day. But that's kind of where I left it right now for Wyatt. The film I watched, all 2023, I watched Penn State, Oklahoma State, and BYU. So now that we're like an hour and a half into this video and been talking forever, we can finally get into the top prospect, which was on the thumbnail. You already probably know who it is right now. I have Emery Jones Jr. as my top prospect in this class, and someone who I would probably take in the middle of the first round. He is a young right tackle, going to be roughly 21 years old. He's 6'6", 322 pounds. Really love the size there. He plays with a high motor. He is a super physical player. He's someone who wants to put defenders in the dirt. He has great athleticism as well, and someone who explodes out of his stance. I think he has really good length too. There's a lot to work with there. Not elite, right? But really good tools that he combines together. He's also someone who gets plenty of movement in the run game. And as far as his core strength, that's one thing that really stands out with him. I think was one of the reasons for the pro comp I have for him. Now, concerns, there's still some things here, but I'm not really thinking that he's a player who's going to bust at the next level. I feel pretty confident in his projection right now. I do think that he can improve his leverage and hand placement. And despite his athleticism, similar to Simmons, who really, like, I think Jones is just kind of a better version of him. They both struggle with those speed rushers coming around the edge. He also doesn't consistently line up blocks at the second level, so he can do a better job once he gets past the line of scrimmage. And I think just in general, he can improve his ability to sustain blocks, which that's something we know for a lot of players. So not the end of the world, but he's generally pretty good at a lot of these things. Does have the anchor issues though. Like we had with some of these air prospects, I think he can just do a better job absorbing hits and getting the proper leverage to deal with that. Now, my summary for Emery Jones Jr., I wrote that he's a freakishly athletic prospect for playing offensive tackle. He explodes out of his stance and shows the ability to keep up with any defender. He combines this with great physicality and the desire to put defenders in the dirt. He's a good asset in the run game, often getting great movement as long as he can line up his hits. It should be noted that Jones is still a young prospect and has plenty to refine. While he's a strong hands fighter, he struggles with placement and often relies on his core strength to recover. Surprisingly, Jones is also susceptible to speed rushers despite great athleticism. He's already a very good prospect who should warrant an early round selection, but he could continue to rise if he puts together another good season. So getting into my pro comp here, I went with Tyler Smith. Reason why? Well, Jones is slightly leaner than him. Both players were ones that succeeded with physicality and great core strength. They were both players as well that had a good combination of speed and power, but still had a bit of refining to do heading into the draft. And, even with that, both will probably end up being first-round picks at the end of the day. So I like that comp form. Not a perfect one, but that's what I went with. Once again, middle of the first-round grade for Emery Jones Jr. My film reviewed, I watched Florida State, Ole Miss, and Wisconsin, all from the 2023 season. So, finally wrapped up this list. We had 15 guys we talked about, 5 guards, 10 tackles. Realistically, I think if you're talking about what they play in the NFL, you probably got half and half. So a lot of these tackles, I think, will move to guard at the next level. But it's a good class. I think there's a lot to work with. There's not, to me, that bona fide elite tackle at the top. But I think at the guard position, it's really strong at the top. And I think if you can land, ideally, one of the Alabama guards, you're in a great situation. You're going to get a long-term starter and guys that are just really going to fit well into your program. Those are definitely, out of this group, my favorite players in Tyler Booker and Jaeden Roberts. But there's a lot of guys to work with. You talk about Jonah Monheim, Josh Simmons, a lot of players I do really like from this class. So that's what I've got for today. The next video is going to be super long too, because we're going to be talking about cornerbacks and safeties. I think right now I've got 16 prospects. We'll see if it ends up staying at 16. Might be less, might be more, but it'll be another one, and then, another long one. And then we'll get into maybe some shorter ones, getting back to maybe 8 to 10 prospects a video. But I appreciate anyone who watched through this. It was a long one, right? But at least give you some thoughts on some of these prospects early on. So thanks for watching. I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. Enjoy this off season. We're getting closer and closer. Less than 100 days away now from the first game of the regular season. So we'll be there soon. But appreciate it. Hope you all have a great rest of your weekend. And finally, go Jags.